Ding ding. So it's a very brief overview of Swiss politics, the Swiss political system. Not something I normally talk about in English. It has to be said, I get invited to talk about Swiss politics, but in German on Swiss radio and Swiss television, because they find it interesting to have an outsider's point of view of their own political system. But it's something I happily talk about because it interests me, and because the Swiss system is very different from any other system. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible so that you follow what I'm saying, but obviously if you have questions then do ask them. So, Switzerland was founded in 1291 by three men. They look a little bit like Lord of the Rings extras, but three men stood in a meadow beside Lake Lucerne allegedly on the 1st of August. It's not known exactly what date, but the 1st of August is the national day. And they swore an oath of confederation, brotherly love, to help each other, sickness and health, that sort of thing. And it was against the Austrians. The Austrians, the Habsburg Empire at that time, ruled most of this part of Europe. And these three communities, each of the men represented one of the original three cantons. A canton is the building block of the Swiss state. And they represented Schwyz, Uri and Unterbauern, the three original cantons. And it was really to stand up to Austrian oppression. William Tell did not figure in the story because he did not exist. He is a myth, even though most Swiss people believe he did exist. And the cantons are like the states in America, just much smaller. So they're the size of counties, but they have the same power as a state. They have their own flag, their own education system. They used to have their own currencies before the federation. They have a lot of their own laws. And so, for instance, a good example, the horse meat scandal that is going through Europe at the moment, horse disguised as cows. In Switzerland, each canton tested its own food samples. They were all doing the same tests, but each canton was responsible for its own food safety. So whereas in England or Germany there was one national test, in Switzerland there were lots and lots of different tests, so that each canton was responsible for its own food. So there are lots of places where the division of power is too much, and you can see where having something federal would be a benefit. And there are lots of places where they actually want to protect the canton. There are 26 cantons, but this is Switzerland, so it's not that easy. 6 of the cantons are half cantons, sometimes. And that's because originally there were 22 cantons and they were all equal. And then part of the French-speaking part of Canton Bern, the one we're in, broke away in 1978 and became a separate canton, Canton Jura. And that was canton number 23. And if you look on a 2-franc coin or a 1-franc coin, there are 23 stars around the statue of Helvetia on the coin to represent the 23 cantons. But 3 of those cantons are divided in half because of historical reasons. So 2 of them disagreed about religion. So the 2 Appenzels, one is Protestant, one is Catholic. And the 2 Basels, they disagreed about the division of power between town and countryside, so they split. But since the new constitution, the 6 half cantons have equal sovereignty, equal power as the 20 full cantons. And so there are 26. The only time the 6 half cantons are still half cantons is in Parliament, which we'll come on to, and in a referendum. And then their votes only count as half. It's a complicated system because the half cantons don't want to reunite, even though they've got over their differences. Basel, Land and Stadt will never reunite, probably, because they like each other but not very much. And the other cantons don't particularly want to give their cantons full power, because then it would dilute their power. So it remains this halfway house, and most of the time the cantons are all equal, but some of the time, and not very often, there are 6 half cantons. It's not that important, it's only important when we come on to Parliament. Each canton has its own parliament, has its own government, and is elected by the people. Those are elected by the people. And each cantonal government is a mirror of the federal government here in Bern. So I'll just talk about the federal government. But basically the rules apply to every cantonal government and every community government as well. It's the same system all the way down. Bern has only been the capital since 1848, and it's actually not the capital. It's officially called the Federal City, because to call it the capital would imply that it's more important than other cities. And as we know, in the Swiss system, nothing should be more important than the others. So it is called the Federal City because it's where the federal parliament and the federal government sit. That doesn't make it officially the capital. 1847 was the last civil war between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholics lost, but the Protestants could see that they needed to build a proper peace, and so they got rid of what had been the Confederation, i.e. cantons which were loosely allied, but essentially separate states. It was like 22 little states all joined together, moving in the same direction. And they were roughly called Switzerland, but not really. Following Napoleon's invasion, his defeat, the Swiss Civil War, they came up with a new constitution, created a federation with a government in one place, with a parliament in one place. And they chose Bern because it wasn't Zurich or Geneva, and because it's roughly in the middle of the country between the French and German-speaking parts. So they built a parliament, which you can see over the river, and the parliament is made up of 2 equal houses. Both houses are elected at the same time every 4 years, always in October. So we know the next 20 elections, we know exactly when they're going to be. And generally, the politicians are not professional politicians. Most of them have other jobs. Generally, they work 3/4 of their life in politics, and the rest of the time they're lawyers, doctors, farmers, policemen, business people. And that is seen as a way of keeping them down to earth, a way of controlling the political system, of making it relevant to the people because these people have normal lives and not just political lives. Of course, there are full-time politicians, and it is seen as quite difficult now to cope with being a part-time politician, part-time worker. And you'll see quite a few politicians have what the Swiss call burnouts and retire from public life for a while, go to a clinic or whatever. So it is a system which is not under threat but under discussion, because it's hard to see how it can continue with people juggling 2 lives and still continuing to rule effectively or govern effectively. Rule is the wrong word. Switzerland has never had an emperor or a monarch or a king or a general or a president in charge. It's always been a community of cantons with no one person in power. The larger House of Parliament, and Parliament is modelled on the US Congress. So the larger house is like the House of Representatives. It represents the population. It has 200 seats, and the seats are divided up by canton based on population. So the smallest cantons have the minimum 1 seat. You can't have half a seat. So the smallest canton by population is Appenzell-Innerrhoden. It's 15,000 people. It's basically a town, but it's a canton. It has the powers of a canton, and so it elects 1 member of parliament. These elections are by proportional representation. It's a party list system. So in Zurich, for instance, or in Bern, Bern has 26 seats in parliament, in the lower house. So every person in Bern who votes has 26 votes. And you vote, and there are hundreds of candidates across 19 parties. And you can vote for a whole party if you want. You can give all 26 votes to one party, or you can split your votes across parties, across people. But you have 26 votes because there are 26 seats. And Bern elects 26 representatives. You do not have a representative for your district. It is on a cantonal basis. And so, of course, the 26 votes and seats are spread across many different parties. So in the lower house, there are 12 different parties. Some of the smaller ones only have 1 or 2 seats. The largest ones have 50, 60 seats. The smaller house, we're not supposed to call them lower and upper because they are equal in power. Not like in Britain where the House of Commons has more power than the House of Lords. Here, the 2 houses are exactly equal. Every law has to go through both. The smaller house is the Council of States, and it is based on the canton, just like the Senate. So it's 2 seats per canton, no matter how big they are. This is where the half cantons come in, because the half cantons logically have half, so they have one seat. So Appenzell Innerrhoden, again, to use the smallest canton as an example, it has one seat because it's half a canton. Its sister, Appenzell Outerrhoden, has the other seat for that canton joined together. Whereas Canton Bern just has 2 seats, Canton Zurich has 2 seats, even though Canton Zurich has 1.5 million people. And Canton Uri, which is a full canton, has 25,000 people. They still both have 2 seats. Exactly like Rhode Island and California in the Senate. It's equal, and it's to make sure that the small cantons are not always outvoted. Exactly the same principle as the Senate, to give the small cantons a say. Here there are fewer parties because the smaller parties find it hard to get elected. There's only 7 parties. But again, no one party ever has a majority. And the same in the lower house, no one party ever has a majority. It's not like in Congress or in the Commons, where one party can have a majority. With 12 parties, you never have a majority with one party. So no one person or party is ever in control. It's always about consensus, not confrontation. It's always about conversation and compromise. It's never about yabu, us and them. It is a little bit, but at the end of the day, they have to find a compromise because one party can't say, well, we're going to do this and we have the votes to do it. Parliament is elected every 4 years. And it's like Congress, except for one big thing. Parliament elects the government. So it's the 246 members of both houses together, 200 in the lower house, 46 in the upper house. They come together after the general election, so in October. In the following December, 2 months later, Parliament comes together for the first time. Parliament does not sit all year round, it sits 4 times a year for 3 weeks each time. So it's only 12 weeks of the year, because they have other jobs to go to. And in December, they elect the government. And the government is always 7 people. Here there's 8 people, and I'll explain why in a minute. 7 people, and they are elected for 4 years. They are exactly equal. Not one of the 7 has more power than any other of the 7. It is government by committee, always. They represent different departments, so there's a foreign minister, a home minister, an economics minister, a defense minister. They can change departments, but usually they are elected, then they decide within themselves, the 7, who gets what department, and they pretty much stay there for the 4 years. It used to be that federal councillors stayed until they died or retired. And they used to go on forever. The longest serving federal councillor was 35 years, he was in government. But that was in the 19th century when things were slightly different. These days, if you get to 11, 12 years, it's unusual. The Swiss foreign minister, Micheline Camire, retired 18 months ago. She had been foreign minister for 11 years, and obviously in government for 11 years. The government, the 7 members, always represent the largest parties, nearly always. At the moment it represents 5 parties because of a debate that went on 4 years ago. Essentially, normally it's the 4 largest parties, and so it's a permanent coalition of the 4 largest parties, so that they have to agree so that you don't get opposition and government. You just get government. The opposition comes from Parliament or from the people. And so, essentially, when they get elected to government, when they become a federal councillor, they are supposed to leave their party politics behind, because they now represent the nation, not their party. So you can get a situation very frequently where a member of government, for example, the Justice Minister, who's the second from the right, Simonetta Sommaruga from Bern, she is from the left-wing Social Democrats, but she might very well have to propose and promote a policy she disagrees with personally, her party disagrees with, but because the government, as a committee, have decided that is the government's policy, she then has to put it forward, even if she disagrees with it. The 8th person, standing on the right, is the Federal Chancellor, and it's sort of head of the civil service. So, also elected by Parliament, but not really a political position, sits in the council, but doesn't have a vote, and is in charge of all the people who work for the government. Because obviously the 7 governing members can't do all the work themselves, they have lots of underlings, and she is in charge of the underlings.
Is it a majority vote within
You never know. That's why they have 7, so that you can always have a decision, but the votes are never released because the internal discussions are not supposed to be made public, because once they have made a decision, they all have to support it, okay? And so it is therefore not important whether in the discussion they supported it or not. As a government, that is their decision. So the personalities don't come into it. So there's an unwritten convention that once you're elected in the government, you do not campaign on behalf of your party. It has been broken, and it wasn't popular when it was broken with Christoph Blocher 8 years ago. He appeared on election posters, which was really unusual and has never happened since. Because they're elected by Parliament, not by the people, there is no campaigning. It just takes a simple majority. And generally, they are re-elected each 4 years until they decide to resign or retire, generally. There have been exceptions, and it has created minor earthquakes. Christoph Blocher, who was the leader of the Swiss People's Party, the right-wing party, in 2003 he ousted a sitting minister. The first time that had happened since 1874. That's how infrequent it was. 4 years later, he was ousted. Partly in revenge, partly because he had made himself look more important than his other 6 colleagues by appearing on posters, by making himself into a tall poppy. And because no party has power in Parliament, every member of the government has to be